All right. Welcome back. I think all right is starting to become a personal greeting of a sort. It's quite fascinating. I never, I don't know where it came from, but it just does. So last time we spoke a bit about origins of art and etymology of art and the importance of its emergence within the evolutionary prospects. And it is interesting. So, one of the things that I delve into with the book is this transformation of the energetical sphere that becomes materialized through the evolutionary development. And that is something that I find quite fascinating, to be honest. How from, well, we would say nothing, but essentially it's not nothing, it's an energetical field. So there is something happening, definitely. So, how this dimension of nothing becomes something materialized through this dimension of well, I'm not going to say that, but what becomes peculiar to me is that there is this concept that it appears to reiterate itself over and over again. So it goes without saying that accumulation of certain parameters will yield certain results. That is as far common sense goes. So, and that is the what I would characterize as actuality. So, meaning that the actual emerges as manifestation of the underlying parameters. So it is interesting, kind of a thinking about how this exchange also creates content that defines the artwork. But at the same time, it does so under this dimension and under the contextualization of these very elements that define it, and as such achieves a qualitative attributes that we anchor that we anchor within perception of the unified specter, the artwork itself. And if it was that simple, it would be great, but it never is. And I think that's kind of the beautiful and the fascinating specter of it. The fact that art does not exist solely on the premises of the finalized work. And there is a very good reason for it. And to me, that this is kind of one of those things that truly propelled me into art and that truly makes it so that I find it quite appreciative, both from the point of people that have established art within the prospect that I'm speaking about now. I think that if there was not this amount, all of these thinkers that have initiated a chain reaction of thoughts, not solely within my head, but I guess within the head of those that are interested. I'm not sure if I would be able to grasp certain contextualizations and as such bring about all of these understandings that I kind of feel this series is in many ways culmination of. So it becomes truly interesting looking at it from the point of creation of art and also the value embedded, because through the dimension of reiteration, every artist, every maker chooses the content that is supposed to be reiterated. And within that prospects, things like memory, individual perception, are also just some of the concepts that inevitably define what comes about. And I think like art is truly interesting exactly because it allows one to examine all of the different thoughts and dimensions where the table of contents is as important as the finalized piece. So I think within the context of creating art and the process of transfer that exists, it is this chain, or it is this flux that I find fascinating, and especially within the context where this flux becomes, in a sense, energy transformed. So the kinetic system that artist, medium, and canvas, but artist, medium, and this field of interaction. So artist, medium, and the field of interaction enter into a kinetic system that has its physical components. It's movable. It reacts and acts. But at the same time, that kinetic system isn't solely contingent upon the physical, but it's also kind of a contingent upon all the parameters and dimensions that precede creation as such. And I think one of the most interesting prospects of art for me is defined by language, where art becomes this. Nobody is stranger to art being spoken about as being alive. So art is alive. That is something that we have heard. I think everybody has heard that phrasing, and I think most of us would agree. And I think it's quite interesting to me looking at art from the point of its aliveness, exactly because what we have at hand is something immaterial, something that inevitably does not exist on the premises of energetical feedback loop that defines living entities. And yet there is this dimension where art, in good art, like great art, all art pulsates, don't misunderstand me, but there is this dimension of codification, of energetical transfer that I personally find fascinating, exactly within the context of aliveness of the inanimate. And I have a really good example of that. I was at Royal Academy, so just before I moved to London, I was at Royal Academy, and they had an abstract expressionism exhibition happening, where the works were pulsating with so much energy that I felt drunk for hours afterwards just by seeing it. I definitely felt like the impact of these intense energies. And personally, for example, I can't be in a room with gloomy Rothkos. Like that is not happening. So the intensity of the artwork is very peculiar to me, exactly because it exists on these bizarre premises where something that shouldn't be able to pulsate inevitably does so. And that is really, really interesting, because it does speak about these dimensions of transfer that occur within the existence of us as species, and that kind of are partaking in a system defined by physical laws. So how this dimension of exchange occurs to such a degree that it codifies and in a sense encapsulates energy, that in its own right both defines the artwork, but furthermore it gives it its own autonomy in a sense. And I think it's like interesting to look at it exactly from the transformative aspect, where energy establishes, it enters a new form. In many ways, I'm thinking about, so the beginning of the book that I've written starts with take a piece of paper, do whatever you want with it. And like a lot of these thoughts kind of came about to me was I was playing it with the paper at that particular point, and I was kind of contemplating over the fact that if I take the paper and scrunch it, it will leave, my hands leave the mark, my emotional state leaves the mark, the aura, the energetical sphere that encapsulates my body and that my body emits is inevitably intertwined with the pattern of the paper. So this dimension of transfer within the human existence and the aura that is connected to such is one of those topics that I find utterly fascinating. Before we continue, just to define aura, aura is defined as emitted a qualitative specter of emitted energy that encapsulates a living entity, or energy emitted from the living entity that is recognized within its qualitative specter. So aura is this interesting concept where it kind of resides on the point between mystical and mystification, knowledge that is there to be attained, yet we still have not come that far. So in many ways, aura is also quite emblematic, I feel, about the age. Like the prospects of aura and speaking about such are quite emblematic of the age that we are living in. Exactly on the premises where it is connected to scientific progress that we have yet, and which is yet to examine and delve into these particular rabbit holes on one side, and on the other side it exists as this mystified concept that kind of belongs to the occult or like phantasmagorical world. So it is quite interesting, and I think a lot of the I'm not sure if I would be speaking about this in the way I'm doing now if there wasn't for Walter Benjamin or Walter Benjamin that has allowed himself for such concepts to enter the philosophical discourse on a highly credible level. So Walter Benjamin was a philosopher, and he is famous for his writings, which are absolutely brilliant and enjoy them quite a lot. But in this particular instance, what we're speaking about is a very specific essay called The Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that is dealing exactly with this dimension. What is going to happen with art, where the incessant proliferation of technological advancements heralds for new ways to create a captivating imagery, which deals which inevitably deals with all of the prospects. Actually, kind of a lot of the similar prospects as the ones that we're facing now. And there is this question of what is aura and how aura is connected to the mystical dimension within the arts. And aura, like as we kind of spoke about it a bit before, it becomes interesting from the prospect where artwork becomes encapsulation of moment. So artwork becomes encapsulation of time, where the movement is locked within a precise render solicited by the artist. So it is interesting to me because it not only speaks about aura and this energetical transfer, but it also kind of touches upon this prospect of how is memory transformed, and to which degree is memory to which degree does this encapsulation truly allow for energy to pulsate within the work on one side, versus how much of such is our imagination, or the fact that everything in this world is, I was thinking of like it still moves. I'm starting to think that kind of meant a bit something slightly different, because kind of the more one looks at the process, the more one truly understands that process itself appears alive, which is not a very difficult thing to understand, because as we start deconstructing the nature of reality and go slowly into physics, what we do understand is that every single second there is millions of small neutrinos that pass through our bodies, and they're not supposed to do anything. For example, they don't alter or interact. However, it is fascinating to think that the granularity of our existence does not even compare itself to the macroscopic experience we as species have. And all of this becomes truly, truly interesting because it does touch upon further metaphysical concepts that skyrocket both in their complexity, but also become a bit of a elitistic sport in a sense, where this dimension of access to different forms of understanding ultimately ushers and heralds a form of a cognitive split within those that are granted such versus those that are kind of outside of the specter. And aura inevitably is tied to this energetical transfer. And today, for example, aura is not necessarily a demystified concept as much as it used to be. We have aura cameras that are able to capture this particular energetical emission, and as such act as a medium that brings about something that was invisible to the human eye. Or it's not actually invisible to the human eye, it just takes a lot of time to both train to see auras, and some are naturally inclined to or predispositioned to see them, and some of them do not. I've had that capacity since I was about to say a child, but that's not entirely true. I had a very strong perception of human energies, but I did not have colorful codification, and that is something that has changed. I can stare at, like if I look at people for a prolonged periods of time without blinking, I can definitely start discerning their aura quite clearly. But it does take a bit of focus, and to be honest, it's also not something that I solicit personally, because it is, in a sense, it is very privatized matter in many ways. So it does feel like you're kind of peeking into something that people would potentially like to keep privatized. So aura is interesting to me exactly from the point of qualitative representation, where every color that is that kind of belongs to the rainbow specter that we are very familiar with has its own codification within the qualitative specter that human existence is based upon. For example, we don't need to go further than the color red to know that it symbolizes certain things where this with the qualitative dimension tied to such. So aura becomes quite interesting exactly within the context of being an individual blueprint on one side, while on the other side it does have the capacity to travel alongside mediums and become entrapped within the field of interaction, so be it canvas or sculpture or whatnot. And to me that becomes truly, truly interesting, exactly because what we're dealing with here is this dimension of exposure and resonance, where the codification of artwork, which grants its autonomy, is contingent upon and lies upon the premise of understanding that is channeled through the means of the artist. So the artist himself doesn't necessarily have to have complete understanding of all the codes that kind of enter into artwork. There are many different ways of looking at art, and there are many different ways of interacting with art, both as a maker and as an onlooker. But what becomes truly interesting to me is this dimension of qualitative exchange where the artist has the capacity to grasp such and transfer this sentiment, in a sense, to something that did not exist within that state before. And now when I'm kind of thinking about it, obviously blank canvas is a work on its own, and there are plenty of artists that have explored this dimension. But what truly becomes fascinating to me is exactly this ushering from the side of the evolutionary process to transmit, to communicate, and to exchange these different values within the parameters of making art, soliciting ultimately an autonomous artwork that we have today. And art kind of becomes, like, art is inevitably heavily intertwined with meaning and semiotics. Every single movement that is encapsulated is summary of the contexts that have kind of gone into defining such. So to me, looking at it from this perspective, it becomes quite interesting from the moment of coding, because it is essentially coding, where the arrangement of elements has a qualitative impact that has been evolutionarily and culturally and geographically sanctioned or warranted in a way. So it is fascinating to think about it, where from the point where establishing these connections within memory and interaction, what occurs is a form of transmission that in its own right does not have the sustainability of a feedback loop as we find within the animate species, but it does incite a form of feeling and qualitative render that is that ultimately defines the artwork itself and grants it its autonomy. So I think this dimension of encapsulation of meaning and semiotics that are defined by the transfer that happens from the side of the artist and onwards. So all of that kind of becomes truly interesting exactly within the concept of feeling artwork creates. And I think as far as the 21st century goes, art has been like the press releases have been quite heavy on creating art within this, or creating an image of an art within the scope of a certain language. Kind of also acts as a codified vessel on its own right. But I think what is interesting now is kind of stepping away from it, and instead of kind of looking on all of these elevated concepts, start actually kind of thinking about the fact that there is this dimension of transfer that occurs between an artist and the artwork, where the encoded energy of the artist is of such character that it stays as a residue on the work. And actually that becomes interesting, especially in the context of art or media or mediums. So not art, sorry, but mediums as a form of a tool of transfer. So where we kind of, one can kind of it becomes a tool of transfer, and work becomes as a codified vessel, not solely contingent upon the premises that define it as such, but also exists within the context of memory and the emotional states that precede it, kind of almost all the way back to the artist's birth, but not solely artists, but everybody's work. I think the artists are a bit more acquainted and focused on this particular dimension. So this dimension of exchange truly becomes peculiar in its own right, where all of these inputs and energetical variations that kind of enter into artwork creates it, they create an assembly essentially that informs, and assembly that informs is a very interesting coining to me, exactly because it it kind of pushes away all of the complexities of codification and exchange it uh, for a dimension where the qualitative and time become quite interesting to look into. And I think, again, it's very difficult. It's quite challenging to speak about these things, not necessarily because I find it difficult to speak, but I think all of these thoughts and all of these amazing ideas have had kind of their headspace and their time on one side, and on the other side, they kind of never came about being able to employ it until now. So again, all of these dimensions of exchange and transfer that I kind of keep speaking about are highly pertinent to our existence, and they're highly pertinent within the context of somebody wanting to go further and not understanding what's happening, versus somebody who kind of understands what's happening, but it's also kind of like feels quite inept in taking action. But kind of going back to what we spoke about, I think that on a personal level, the biggest fascination that I have definitely witnessed to is this energetical transfer through means of morphing. So I'm kind of thinking about, and this is a bit of an annoying thing, but it follows the indie movie, where kind of nobody knows what is it exactly, but it does interact, and you can catch it, as in catch a cold. Um, so it is kind of interesting because we kind of don't know where things are and how things are, but like aura is also quite synonym with this dimension of distinctive presence. So the table of contents, or the elements, define the artwork that exists upon the premises of territorialization of references, where the transfer that occurs from the point of informational exchange from the side of the onlooker towards the field of interaction. And for example, I'm playing. So one of the reasons why I stepped away from oil, for example, is although it is one of those mediums that truly has the capacity to capture what we're speaking about. So I think art becomes quite interesting exactly from the point of becoming a unity that achieves a certain resonance through the arrangement or through the assembly that it has been exposed to, or it has been subjected to. And it's interesting, like it is quite interesting thinking about, like, just I'm thinking just purely from the physical perspective, how this encapsulation of energetical transfer actually occurs, so that an object retains its own pulsation, or pulsation of that specific element. In many ways, I find that quite fascinating and quite mesmerizing with art. And I think, as far as mesmerization goes, one can kind of look at creating art exactly as codification of mesmerization. Kind of like if one if one kind of looks at creative people, be it artists or any other, because there are many people that are hyper creative and quite flexible in their mindset outside their working environment. But what kind of is interesting is that this dimension of mesmerization, so being immersed in something, being utterly one, like unified with it, is interesting exactly because it is subjected to codification. I knew it from fashion, for example, how to exactly which pieces, which color combinations, which heels, everything, how to put it together in order to achieve a bizarrely high impact. So there is also this dimension where the codification of art isn't solely defined by the artwork itself or the objects itself, but also within that scope, what becomes encapsulated through the means of its interaction with the human world. In many ways, it also kind of becomes one of those like battles of conviction. Do we actually believe that this is something that we kind of all agree upon? And in many ways, one can also think about aura and emitted aura as a form of, I was about to say honesty, but I'm not sure if that's true, because if one is a good artist, one will recognize that everything is a form of exchange. So how this exchange occurs within within that context, I'm not sure in its entirety, but it definitely has its elements. And I think kind of like this dimension of negotiation of content and value is quite interesting, exactly from the premises that we're speaking about commercial and non-commercial art, where I'm kind of looking at it and I'm seeing how like becoming an artist is no walk on roses, has its pitfalls and has a lot of them, but where what becomes kind of a codified within the vessel is a particular narrative that is on one level can stand as a representational from the point of artists, while on the other side it exists upon the premises that we have been speaking about. And it's quite interesting to look at art, like the more one trains oneself to speak less and become more intense and perceptive, what kind of becomes truly interesting for me is exactly this exchange that happens on the premises where this movement within the scope of existence um, emerges as one of the possibilities. And I think like if kind of going back to the first caves and kind of looking at art developing, I think it becomes interesting looking at it from the point of territorialization of value, because what art, I think one of the most fascinating but also worrisome answers that I've ever received is the when I ask the question, but I dared to ask what is a good way to approach the subject of value in art, because this is one of the most discussed themes I think in the entirety of the, well, I'm not going to say universe because it's very far from it, but there are definitely some very grand moments within that. And how this dimension of aura and exchange starts impacting the environment we're in and moves it towards something that oneself feels a bit more enjoyable about becomes quite pertinent to the further proliferation of language within the scope of existence. And it is quite interesting where this liberation of precise representation that's kind of occurred the last 20 years or so, I would say last 20 years, it kind of, I feel it started with Robert Nava, but do correct me if I'm not speaking right. But it is quite beautiful looking at me from the point of knowing that codification of artwork is highly dependent upon not solely the elements that define it, but also the relational character. So there are many different ways of approaching artwork within the context and within the prospects, where it doesn't. It's not solely contingent upon locking the premises and parameters that precede the work, such as the emotional state of the artist, humidity of the air, and whatnot, but it also kind of exists within the scope of territorialization of time, where all the movements that have entered into the artwork codify it exactly through the means of exchange. Whilst on the other side, I'm kind of often thinking about this pulsation of artworks and aliveness of artworks. I think it's quite interesting to think about it, how sentiment and qualitative dimension is captured in a state where it essentially exists as in a state of flux and is transformed or reified um, through the means of entering the artwork. So it's kind of this dimension of the position of time that becomes truly peculiar to me within the context of making art. And as such, art, we kind of spoke a bit about art as an ideology. And I think this kind of really nicely connects to it, exactly because it highlights the premise where art doesn't exist solely upon the premise of the finished work, but it is defined by this kinetic exchange from one side to another. Medium being exactly what it is, an intermediary between the instances. So I think it's kind of also interesting to think about that after the invention of camera, art turned into scarcity and started emphasizing exactly this emotional score that I'm speaking about. So this qualitative dimension that pulsates, the emotional exchange that we, in a way, many ways, kind of connect to art and how art exists. So it is it is peculiar. It is peculiar thinking about it from the point where I myself, I'm a creator, and I'm like I'm not creator and creative person, but I'm an artist, and I do notice that, especially when the type of art that I'm dealing with, which is quite a painstaking process, it becomes truly interesting to see how disturbances within the emotional specter change the work and allow for certain things to happen, but do not allow for other things to happen. And it becomes interesting as one makes looking at the artwork from the point of negotiation, where content and value are stipulated, not necessarily against each other, but they exist on the premises where of intertwinement, where all of these threads that the world is dominated by are available for us to employ exactly within this dimension of liberation from precise rendering, which has defined art throughout its historical canon. And I think it's kind of interesting looking at the artwork exactly from the point of credence as well. So, like, what do we think is an interesting artwork? What type of art does continue to proliferate and continues to exist within the scope of time? And I think this dimension of aura also kind of deals a bit with this, with access and resonance that definitely have these uncanny elements about it, especially within the context of specialization. But it's interesting to me looking at the art from the point of it being a form of a battle for conviction or of convictions, where the credence is defined through the means of apprehension of the specific works. And I think it's one of the interesting dimensions with digital art versus the analog art is this exact dimension of being able to move back and forth between mediums and keep it crisp and interestingly clean, which again is also a token of certain things. This exploration of elements and the effects that elements contribute towards is a bit of a science on its own, and it's quite worth thinking about it exactly from the prospects of existence that is not necessarily defined solely upon the premises that we are well acquainted with. And it becomes truly interesting looking at the art exactly from the point of the cognitive development it has had, and how such is inevitably connected to territorialization of value within the scope of existence. So it is truly fascinating to observe how something that is invisible, essentially. Aura is not visible and energy is not visible, but how something that has capacity to destroy actually also has capacity to impose a narrative, and as such force the viewer into a dialogue that has kind of potentially been unknown to us before. And I think it's quite interesting from the point where how we deal with aura becomes quite interesting exactly within the context of digital art versus non-digital art. So up to this point, materialization and tangibility have defined the existence as we know it. However, what happens now is that a lot of the tasks have been taken over by AI as it is, and that is quite rapidly changing, especially in the context of ownership and how such will develop further on. So it is quite interesting to look how this train of thought develops further on its own, and how these dimensions again of codification of mesmerization. So mesmerization, I think a lot of us are very well acquainted with, but it is fascinating. It is fascinating to think that every single dimension of interaction within the human existence is defines the artwork per se, and in that manner, kind of artwork starts. It becomes a codified vessel that sails the sea, or the sea of future on its own on one side, and at the same time it becomes as encapsulation of moments that are meaningful within the context of creation. And it is fascinating. It is so fascinating to think about it, especially in the context of time, where time deposited and captured within the way it is being captured. I'm not sure how this particular physical reactions exist, but it definitely kind of forces one into the specter of contemplation, where artwork also exists on the premises of the emotional exchange and the energetical transfer that the artist himself has been or herself have been exposed to. So all in all, it is truly fascinating, this dimension of art branching out as a process on one side, that on the other side kind of adopts its own uh, purpose, and proliferates further on. So next time what we'll be speaking about is kind of how all of these elements are starting to create a form of impact, where we don't exactly know necessarily how things are going to pan out and where they're going to pan out. But things have resonance, and everything is imbued in meaning. I don't think we can skip that. And I know that there are certain philosophers that have shrouded their shoulders by now, but I do truly believe that um, if one looks at the existence per se, it does not become difficult to imagine how the narrative transmitted through different elements of the assembly contributes to finished work, and that essentially it is very much the process in between that is of importance than the work itself. So thank you for listening, and then we'll speak another day.